Okay, thank you all for joining us today for this first session of TPI's Aspen Forum. Our first session today is on the political economy of telecom reform. So over the past couple of years, maybe more, we've been hearing talk of a new Telecom Act, including from Congress, with the Energy and Commerce Committee asking for white papers on various aspects of what might be an act. And the rhetoric justifying a new law typically talks about convergence and how every relevant firm competes with everyone else. But that was also the justification for the '96 Act, which doesn't mean that it's not true again today, but suggests that we also ought to look elsewhere for explanations as to why it's coming back today. And so among the things that we'll talk about in this panel is what beyond those issues is driving the current push? How have coalitions and interest groups changed since '96, and what do they want? Why now? Is it real? Or is it something more cynical? Okay, so we're done. Hold your questions, please. Dave, hold your questions.
That was quick.
Yeah, and
Next panel.
so that's right, exactly. And we have a distinguished group of people here to address these questions. And I'm going to introduce them first before we start speaking. I'm trimming their bios, so please take a look at them. So first we have Rick Boucher, who's a partner at Sidley Austin and leads the firm's government strategies group. Prior to joining Sidley, he served for 28 years in the U.S. House of Representatives as Virginia's 9th District Congressman. During his congressional tenure, he served on the House Energy and Commerce and Judiciary Committees and chaired the subcommittees on energy and air quality, communications, technology, and the internet, and has been a leading participant in every major telecom policy debate over the past 25 years. We have Peter Davidson, who's Senior Vice President of Federal Government Relations for Verizon. Before joining Verizon, he served as General Counsel to the U.S. Trade Representatives, and before that was Vice President for Congressional Affairs at U.S. West, I think Quest. And prior to that, served as General Counsel and Policy Director to the Majority Leader of the U.S. House of Representatives, Dick Armey. And I'm going in alphabetical order. I'm not actually skipping Phil. But Roger Knoll, in alphabetical order, is Professor of Economics Emeritus at Stanford University and a Senior Fellow at the Stanford Institute of Economic Policy Research, where he directs the program Regulatory Policy. His primary research interests include technology policy, antitrust regulation, and the economics of sports and entertainment. He's the author or co-author of 12 books and over 300 articles and reviews. You may know him most recently from the O'Bannon trial, where he crushed the NCAA, enlightening everyone on why it's actually a cartel and making it more likely that someday they won't exploit athletes. Phil Weiser is the Dean of the Law School, Thompson Professor of Law, and Executive Director and founder of the Silicon Flatiron Center for Law, Technology, and Entrepreneurship at the University of Colorado. He has also spent a lot of time in DC, and prior to his return to the University of Colorado, he served as a senior advisor for technology and innovation to the National Economic Council, director at the White House, and as the Deputy Assistant General at the U.S. Department of Justice Antitrust Division. Okay, so I thought we would start with Rick, having been there and instrumental in the '96 Act. Tell us what led up to it. At what point did people realize that was something real? And are there lessons for it today?
I think there are lots of lessons for it today. First, just let me say thank you very much, Scott, to you and Tom Leonard for inviting our participation on this panel. And this is the second year I've had the privilege to attend your forum in Aspen, and I thank you for the invitation. You were asking a moment ago if it's real, and let me just offer a word about that at the outset. I mean, I can understand the healthy dose of skepticism that anyone applies today to a conversation about any major legislative effort moving through the Congress. I mean, we are affected by gridlock. That said, where bipartisan consensus is possible, change can occur. And I would look back to the time when the House Energy and Commerce Committee adopted virtually everything on a bipartisan basis. We worked squarely in the center. Democrats and Republicans participated together. That committee potentially is the most bipartisan committee in the House of Representatives. And the issues it addresses historically have not drawn a partisan difference. They will draw sectoral differences. They will draw geographic specific differences. But they tend not to be partisan issues. That has changed to some extent, as it has changed across the Congress. And on outlier issues in the telecom space, like network neutrality, you now see a lot of partisan debate. And I would say if network neutrality finds its way into the heart of a telecom reform, it's not going to happen. I agree with the comment gratuitously offered from the floor a moment ago. But if it stays on the outside, and hopefully the FCC will reach a reasonable decision about that, a middle way approach, utilizing Section 706, and put that issue to bed prior to this telecom reform actually starting through the legislative process in Congress. Telecom issues have always been bipartisan. I recall the '96 Act being adopted with Democrats and Republicans working actively together. We didn't see a partisan line. I participated actively with Billy Tozen and with Mike Oxley, with Joe Barton, with others who were actively involved in the debate in those days, and they worked with other Democrats in a seamless fashion, and we were focused on policy. The Stella legislation, which is currently pending, the reauthorization of what we used to call the Satellite Home Viewer Act, also has a bipartisan foundation and is moving through the process, past the House, Senate version, likely to clear the Senate, and we anticipate that passing at least by the end of this year. So it can happen. Is it real this time? Yes, I absolutely think it is. The last time that we had a major reform in the telecom space was 1996. That was 18 years ago. Since that time, there have been dramatic changes in the marketplace and in technology, in the expectation of consumers, in the way in which consumers receive their information, in the growing demands now for broadband. Back in 1996, dial-up was predominant. The internet had barely been a commercial medium. It was first commercialized in 1992. And the debate in 1996 was really about plain old telephone service. Who could offer local, who could offer long distance. And in that time, reasonable decisions were made, compromises occurred, and in the end, a policy was adopted that could contemplate the convergence of services onto a common platform with fiber optic technology. We could see the promise of that. But at that point in time, convergence was clearly aspirational. It really didn't exist in practice. Today, it's a marketplace reality. And the law needs to be changed in order to recognize the converged nature of communications today, unlike the circumstance we faced in 1996. Your question was pretty broad. You asked, what lessons can we learn? Let me just offer a fundamental one. In 1996, we had a kind of a start and stop process. The process actually began in 1988 when the first legislation was introduced that would enable telephone companies to offer cable TV service inside their telephone service areas. And then in fits and starts, over the course of the ensuing 6 years, additional pieces were added to the puzzle. And in the end, the markets generally were opened for telecommunications competition, with the local exchange opened, with the R-Box being given the permission to offer nationwide long distance, and with telephone companies being given a green light to offer cable TV service. None of that existed at the time. It was aspirational, but we saw the potential for it to happen. And I think the one thing that perhaps made it the clearest that it could happen was the advent of fiber optic technology, so that on a single capable broadband platform, multiple services could be offered by a single provider. And seizing that opportunity, the '96 Act opened the door for the convergence to take place, for competition to come into the markets, and that competition has come. One mistake I think we made was in the way that we tried to engender competition. I think there are better ways to do it now, and I'll just conclude this answer with this example. In 1996, the main way that competition was fostered was by mandated access to incumbent networks with wholesale pricing. And the wholesale pricing was pretty attractive. It was called TELRIC. It was pricing over the last mile at a level that was very attractive to the competitors. So attractive, in fact, that a lot of competitors got enticed onto the incumbents' networks with that allure of fairly cheap last mile access to the customer. And the result was a tremendous building of overcapacity on the part of the CLECs. Fiber ring got laid over fiber ring. I remember M Street being cut, it seems like every 2 weeks, as yet another CLEC came in and deployed fiber on top of the fiber that the last one had put there. A tremendous uneconomic overcapacity. When that was recognized toward the late 1990s, the market value of many of the CLECs collapsed. And that was a precursor to the dot-com and telecom bubble burst that occurred in the early 2000s. So I think the lesson we learned is mandated access at regulated wholesale prices is probably not the best way to instill competition. Better to look to new models. And what comes to my mind is the example of Google Fiber going to Kansas City and other localities and saying, give us some regulatory incentives. Give us some flexibility in terms of right-of-way access, in terms of other obligations that are pre-existing for incumbents, and let us kind of serve where we choose to serve, and we'll deploy a gigabit-level network, bringing competition, bringing a broad consumer benefit, and guess what? Not only have those benefits been realized, but in the process, the incumbents have been encouraged to upgrade their own networks. So you see the example of AT&T also building gigabit-level networks in Kansas City, Austin, probably other places around the country to come in order to meet the competition. Broad benefits are coming, not with a mandate imposed, but with incentives offered from a regulatory standpoint to encourage appropriate conduct.
Good, thanks. Peter, the telcos were among the leading group looking for a new law in or leading up to 96. They thought the regulations kept them from getting into other businesses.
The incredibly lucrative long-distance business.
Exactly, right. Which we held out as the carrot, right, for allowing competition. But so now again, they're sort of at the forefront of wanting a new telecom act. So from the perspective of a telephone company, well, not right to say that anymore, of a telecom company, what's different now that that wants them to sort of renew, work for a new act, and what's changed in terms of the groups that you think you would be working with or that would oppose the things you want?
Well, everything. And I'm not sure that the premise of your question is actually correct either. I'm not sure that it's accurate to say that all telecom companies are in favor of big reform right now. And I don't even know what you mean by telecom companies anymore anyway. So what are you talking about? Are you talking about wireless companies? Are you talking about wireline, traditional wireline, ILECs? Are you talking about VoIP carriers? Are you talking about cable companies that are now heavily into the voice, data, whatever business? So I think.
Okay, so let me restate it then. Would you say that the traditional telecom companies and cable companies are now aligned in their objectives for what they would want in an act?
I don't think so. And let me start by saying I'm not trying to be negative in terms of the prospects of this happening.
Be negative.
Actually,
you think the prospects are negative?
I actually agree with much of what Rick just said in terms of the state of the industry, about where we are in terms of the outdated laws, about technology having advanced to the point at which it's really a large disconnect. So I think there's a lot of desire and there's a lot of recognition of the need to do something in many different sectors. Rick talked about video, privacy, cyber, internet governance, all of which I think there's a real need to look at this and modernize the structures. But I don't believe that there is alignment within any of the industries per se, like there was in '96. There was, a coalition. There was a big group that had very unified objectives on both sides. It just so happened that the long distance companies and the ILECs thought that they could get something. Each thought they could get something out of reform. So they were either willing to go into reform or were driving for reform at that point. Today, I think we have a much more eclectic group. Everyone is coming at it. Even the traditional telecom companies are no longer traditional telecom companies. More revenue is coming in to their businesses from internet-related services than the traditional telecom services. And those companies have taken different paths. So I think you have a much different environment than you had in '96. You have a lot of companies pushing for reform from different directions. And I also think you have a lot of dissatisfaction, not just from the company's perspective, but I think there's many in the consumer advocate area, in the internet, the edge provider area, and other kind of internet services that are increasingly looking at our structure and saying that it's out of date, outmoded. And what's interesting is to see, I think we live in an era where consumer welfare has been greatly enhanced by the internet. I mean, there's no disputing the fact that all kinds of services and all kinds of benefits have flowed to consumers and others. What we don't know is what's the delta between that and the consumer benefit that could be happening that's above that if we actually had modernized laws. So, that sounds like a very chaotic environment, and in a sense it is. But I still think that there's a real consensus around the need for reform when I talk to people across the political spectrum and from companies and others. The need to modernize based on an internet culture instead of the culture of the 1934 Act or the 1996 Act, I think is ultimately what's going to bring these disparate entities together to push for reform.
And so you think even though each of these different groups may have all different objectives, I mean, if you look at who's filed comments or to the white paper request, it's a host of industries, some that would never have appeared in '96, energy management companies, for example.
Right.
But you think that they can have enough common ground that they'll actually be able to work with Congress to do something?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that there's a kind of a growing realization that all of these new technologies, these products and services that are coming online and a part of the internet ecosystem are looking at the prospects of being regulated under Title II and realizing that before they invest their money in building out those kind of structures, some kind of certainty on the regulatory front would be a good thing. One of the reasons I think there's a lot of energy behind reform is exactly the number of comments that have come in and the diversity of comments from different sources about problems that have been identified in each of these white papers that's come out. So I mean, I wouldn't say it's a unified voice calling for reform, but it's a lot of voices calling for different types of reform. And that's exactly the situation where under our constitutional system that Congress has to look at those big policy questions. And this is not necessarily, I think the FCC does a good job of looking at specific issues and trying to fix them as we go along. But this is a bigger question, and this is something for Congress to tackle.
Phil, you raised this point when we were talking that that Congress needs some sort of organizing principles if they're going to put together some kind of act. So how should they think about this going forward?
So let me first start with a point that I think Peter adverted to, and it is a nice way to acknowledge Rick and all of his leadership over the years. One challenge in Congress today is who's going to be the Rick Boucher or the Tom Talkie or the Tim Wirth on the committee who gets enough into this subject, which is pretty arcane, because you can't legislate based on just talking points, high level. You've got to actually have some command of the substance. And the challenge is Congress, persons are really spread very thin. And the ability to think through organizing principles and be able to create from first principles takes time, reflection, and those are not encouraged in things in Washington today. So that's one, again, note of caution. which again, Dave previewed in the outset. In terms of what organizing principles or how to start from first principles, I'd say a few points. First, I would give a nod to Joe Barton. When I testified, it was very gratifying because he actually listened, and he then asked a question that showed he listened, and he said, how do we protect and enable innovators that don't exist today? And so one organizing principle, and a nod here would go to Schumpeter, is this sector is going to have lots of ongoing innovation, more in the next 18 years than it had in the last 18. Unfortunately, the 96 Act was written in a very static mindset. The dynamics that drove that act was a, ambiguous contract between the long-distance companies and the incumbent telcos. Both sides could point to things in the law that they thought were good for them. A few people here could actually remember what Track B entry in 271 of the Act was. And that got that law passed and then left the FCC have to implement it with a recipe for lots of litigation and lots of work for lawyers. And that's because that was a static law that got very detail-oriented between two sets of entities who were really pushing for the law. Now, as we've discussed, we've got all sorts of different types of entities out there. And to do it, and to do it right, would require from first principles, which is not technology specific, because the technologies are going to change over time. One way to think about that is to, again, go back to Joe Barton's question, which is what are we trying to do to enable ongoing innovation? And I would start with two broad points, and then I'll go deeper on one of them. One is in spectrum, there needs to be a system that allows for efficient use of spectrum and better access to spectrum, access to both licensed and unlicensed. The revolution that's happened in wireless over the last 18 years has been unbelievable and completely unforeseen or untouched by the 1996 Act. So to the extent the 1996 Act succeeded, I would say, with all respect, Rick, that it succeeded despite what Congress did. And that was fine, because it was still a success. Wireless is a great success. But almost nothing the 1996 Act directly bears on wireless. So that's a point worth reflecting on. Also, almost nothing the Act bears on broadband internet service. So the Act could be said to be successful, although on its own terms, much of what it tried to do, the whole local to long-distance entry, we look back on and we say, well, I guess that wasn't all that it was cracked up to be. So, but wireless deserves real attention, and access to wireless resource is very important. Pierre DeVries and I have written on that, and those who want to talk further with us, we welcome that.
So just to interrupt you for a
Please.
second.
Yeah.
So if in some of our biggest areas of success or innovation are wireless and broadband, and those are things the Act didn't say anything about, why should we have a new Act that does say something about them?
So that's a very good point. The way the Act of the future, can operate is to, and this is asking a lot of Congress, which is why it may not happen, and it might be a fine thing if it doesn't happen, is if you can clear away some underbrush and create some structures that are modernized, you can make things work better. Right now, the FCC is being asked to do a lot of improvisation, and it has some room to, improvise, and that might be fine. But obviously, that's not the first best world. However, living in a second best world is better than a third best world. And the third best world would be a world where Congress does more technology-specific legislating, and the FCC finds itself painted into a corner in technologies that are anachronistic, local versus long distance, for example. Now, can we get to a state where Congress is able to have the restraint to do high-level principles and have some level of confidence that the institutions can implement them? That's going to ask a lot of Congress. Congress hasn't necessarily always been in that mood. But if you look in successful regimes, I would point to the Sherman Act, that's exactly what Congress did. They took some very high-level principles, and they've left it to the relevant agencies, the FTC, the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department, and the courts to oversee the implementation of those principles. A principle that would have to get reckoned with is interconnection and interoperability. And here we look back to the railroads, where these principles also were relevant. Standards and standardization is not going to end as a challenge. Internet governance, one of the challenges is as we move to IP version 6 or to other compatible technologies, how do we do that? How do we do standardization? And that's going to be a challenge that we're going to have to reckon with. Another issue on interconnection, think about the Terminal Railroad case. There you had, in that case it was an antitrust court, but recognizing in some cases you need some forms of mandated cooperation for competition to exist. Now, when do those cases exist is something we have to work through, but I don't think Congress will be able to prescribe them down to each specific case. And so one of the big challenges for Congress will be to legislate at a high enough level, and if they can't do that, if the alternative is too specific, too down in the weeds, then yes, it's probably better if we don't have the act at all.
Do you think the fact that the number of groups and interests have grown so much since '96 makes it more or less likely that Congress will be able to write a law that sort of sets general principles rather than addressing each group's needs?
So it depends on the leadership. So Rick was there in 1996 when they passed the Tax Reform Act, where lots of specific lobbying groups got, basically creamed. And Congress actually started from first principles and passed the Tax Reform Act that closed lots of loopholes, didn't write in special benefits. The problem is that every single group is asking for their special benefits. And if you cater to that, and you've got a 1,000-page bill that has 50 pages for every group, we're screwed. So the challenge is, can you get people to say, listen, we're committed to a high-level set of principles that will provide some structure and are going to allow for constant evolving approaches. Congress may or may not have that restraint. In order to have it, you're going to have the type of leadership of people like in the 1986, or 1986 Tax Reform Act, where people were willing to get into the substance and to stick to high-level principles.
Scott, could I just mention one thing? I heard a little, I said I agreed with almost everything Rick said, and I think I may have agreed with all of it, but I want to get a clarification, because I think what Phil just said is very important, and there's a little tension with what Rick said. I agree completely that it's going to have to be a bottom-up, first principles review, and it can't be messing around the edges to tweak, setting up more silos or what silos are able to do what. That is an exercise in futility, and it's going to just result in, it's going to melt down at some point. Rick said that if Congress takes on the net neutrality question, that the reform will be dead. And this may not be different views, because I think if you talk about it the way Phil just did, which is setting up a broad framework with core principles that are then applied by the expert agency to deal with specific situations that come up in a new technological setting, that's a way to deal with the net neutrality issue, but at a level that's not getting into the muck of where we are on 706 versus Title II and kind of in the weeds there. And some of the work that Verizon has done over the years, I think, has been along the lines of what Phil said, in trying to find, in terms of our work with Google and our work with Congressman Waxman, trying to find a place where you can have those broad principles that are easily applied. I think that's an area where you can get consensus in Congress because it's at a high level and it's not industries going in and getting special deals for particular silos.
Let me just comment as well that I think Phil is right. High-level principles have to be the focus of anything Congress does, if in the end it is to be successful. He also commented on leadership. And unlike '96, I think the leadership in the run-up to the new telecom reform is being more thoughtful than ours was then. The leadership of our committee didn't really seriously get engaged in the telecom reform until fairly late in the process. Individual items of legislation opening the door to competition in one market after the other preceded the true engagement by the committee and its leadership. This time, by distinction, you've got Fred Upton and Greg Walden setting the schedule, committing themselves to move forward with this effort, creating a time frame, perhaps realistic, add a little bit of gridlock on top, and you may need to stretch it out a couple more years, but generally realistic. And then creating steps. So beginning with a call for stakeholder recommendations. What do we need to change? Where would you be on the score if we were to change a certain item. And then publishing white papers. And so far, 4 white papers have been published by the 2 chairmen addressing high-level principles, addressing telecom reform generally, addressing spectrum needs generally, addressing competition and interconnection. This is a very thoughtful approach, much more far-sighted than what we did in '96. So, on leadership, I'm a Democrat. I guess it's with credibility that I say this. Then I give these 2 Republicans real credit for setting a workable time frame, creating a focus on high-level principles. There are some subset issues that telecom reform needs to address, but these are high-level principles too, and I'm just going to briefly list a couple of things. First of all, we've still got this stovepipe structure at the FCC. It's a relic from the '96 era where cable is regulated one way, telco's another, wireless another, and yet these are all converged industries now. They're all offering the same products, voice, video, and data. They're in head-to-head competition with each other, and they should be regulated in a common way. They should respond to a central regulatory principle, and there should be regulatory parity across the board as applied to these providers of the same service. Only Congress can do that. The FCC can't realign that structure. It takes an act of Congress to achieve it. That's a high-level principle. One of the greatest challenges we have now is spectrum. Finding enough spectrum to meet the tremendously growing demand for data services. And a new approach needs to be originated for this. The place where the spectrum is, that we could get it the most readily and where it's lightly used, is in the hands of government. And the government agencies, we know, are really reluctant to surrender spectrum. The current approach we have to reallocation from government to the commercial mobile sector, it just isn't working. And even where you get a reallocation, there is tremendous hesitation on the part of the government agency to let it go. So just clearing the spectrum after it's reallocated is hugely problematic. So an innovative approach is necessary. Congress needs to think this through and find a new way to achieve the reallocation from government to the commercial sector. Some have recommended that we adopt a base closing kind of approach. That really worked for closing military bases, where you have a commission look at all of the bases and decide what should be closed, what should be scaled back. And then those recommendations come to the Congress in accelerated fashion, so the bill has to come to the floor quickly, and then you have an up or down vote on the entire package. Every time one of those has been presented, it has passed. If that was done in regular order, with anybody being free to offer amendments, none of them would have passed. People would have collected their friends to preserve their base. It would have been a disaster, but it's worked well. So maybe we need to do that for spectrum, but it's an idea, and one that I think is valuable to consider. Let me just quickly mention one other, and then I'm going to hush. I think we ought to allow more flexible spectrum licenses. Today, if a spectrum is assigned for one purpose, satellite to ground or purely terrestrial, that's what you're stuck with unless you go get a waiver and go through a long and expensive process with an uncertain end. Wouldn't it be nice to allow greater flexibility at the outset in how spectrum is used, energizing a secondary market, and making sure that spectrum goes to its highest and best use, putting it in the hands of the user who can make the most of it? These are high-level principles, and to me, this is what the new Telecom Reform Act ought to be about, and I think that's very consistent with the approach that you've seen from the committee leadership.
So, Roger, why would Congress even want to do this now? Is there something about actual policy that doesn't fit with its preferences anymore, or is this just something, to be as cynical as possible, is it just fundraising?
Well, far be it from me to be as cynical as possible, but I'll be pretty cynical. One of the interesting features, I think, of the debate is that it doesn't take into account the fact that the internet has also changed politics. And We all know from our own experiences that the decentralizing effect of the developments of internet and information technology with respect to content have fundamentally changed the nature of the way anybody communicates with anybody, but in particular the way a political figure establishes his credibility and builds the loyalty of his constituents. And it's the same phenomenon that we observe in, say, MSNBC versus Fox News. It's that the same intelligence that is used by Amazon and Google to sell you stuff is used by political leaders to target messages to you that aren't necessarily inconsistent across groups, but that certainly have almost no overlap. And I think this explains a lot about what, not just what's going on in the debate about revisions of the Telecommunications Act, but a lot of what's going on in Congress. Legislation is no longer the means by which political leaders gain influence and popularity with constituents. Legislation has become relatively unimportant, and it's largely a symbolic gesture as a means to communicate to very specific constituencies. The amount of intelligence within congressional committees and within the staffs of members of Congress, House and Senate, has shifted from being substantive intelligence about policy areas to public relations-y kind of expertise about how to use modern information technology to advance your political career. Now, there was always some element of that, but the point is, what we have to think about, we can't go back to 96, or I have other examples I want to talk about, but 96 is a good one, and think about the politics of the way interest group aggregation led to the 96 Act as the way we would get a new act, because the mechanisms, the interest group aggregation in the creation of a bill, which the 1996 Act is a divide the baby bill. It's giving things to people. It's Christmas tree ornaments to various people, which have the feature that they're procedurally freighted, and it's not obvious who the big winners were from the 96 Act other than the people in this room, the people who make their living playing with the regulatory process. They're the big winners because it's so expensive and protracted and complicated and convoluted. But in terms of policy, I mean, I'll just say, I'm just going to assert, because I don't want that to be the main theme, the 96 Act really didn't do much except create a lot of regulatory processes that didn't go anywhere. And that's important to bear in mind, because that's going to get worse, not better, with the fragmentation of the way that political leaders communicate with their constituencies, and the sort of switch in the content of policy debate from the substance to the effective aspects of it. All right, and so that is the background with which I want to look at this. I think that there is the idealistic conceptualization of how you might get a regulatory reform, and for all I know, the two leaders in the House committee that are currently working on this may well have that as their motive. But that's 2 votes, and we need more than 200 more, and we need another 60 plus in the Senate, and we need the president's signature. And the way you get from the idealistic part to the actual substantive legislation depends on all the nasty little interest group politics that has become worse rather than better, in part because of the Citizens United decision, but more importantly, I think, because of the fragmentation of communications and the fragmentation of the public, which in other ways is a perfectly good thing, but in this case, it's politically difficult, because it means that you don't actually want to solve problems so much as you want to communicate to core little subgroups in your constituencies about what terrible things other people are doing and how if it weren't for you with your finger in the dike, the world would go to hell. And you can't win elections with the finger in the dike model if somebody actually fixes the dike. And I think that's the problem we currently face. We don't have a political process that's now oriented towards fixing problems, because that's not how you get an orientation from the way that you now run for office and build constituencies. So that's sort of observation number one. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm just saying it's extremely unlikely. Then the next part of the story, I think, is that different kinds of regulatory policies are infected by this problem to differing degrees, depending upon how powerful and strong, in both an economic and a political sense, the various fragmented groups are in the process. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 was, in fact, a divide-the-baby compromise where the idea was everybody could walk out of the room thinking they've got something. But the proportion of the industry that was actually being dealt with and the number of interest groups that were actually being dealt with is tiny compared to what's going on now. And so the problem, and let me just sort of remind you of what's going on in the 92 to 95 period in Congress versus the 92 to 95 period on the West Coast and in the Silicon Valley. What's going on in Congress is motivated primarily on the first hand by the desire to get rid of Judge Green's decree and replace it with regulation. And secondly, the desire to accommodate some interests that had gone from being pretty unimportant, but because of the AT&T divestiture process had become important. And then how do we create a regulatory environment that is going to be mutually acceptable to the people they're threatening and the threateners? And that was a fairly narrow group. And so we get all this focus on, as was mentioned, on things that are largely irrelevant, which is long distance versus local service and telephones, right? Meanwhile, back at Microsoft, the strategy of the dominant firm in computer software switches from we want to control the desktop because we want you to buy our applications as well as our operating system to we want to control the desktop because that's going to be the mechanism to get access to the internet. The Microsoft antitrust cases were all about the internet. We seem to forget that. They were all about Netscape and Sun and Intel and other companies developing strategies that would have had the effect of commoditizing the operating system and doing what we now see now, taking the desktop and putting it on the cloud and making it extraordinarily competitive. All right? That was what it was all about. Bill Gates saw the internet coming. Scott McNealy saw the internet coming. Congress didn't see the internet coming. So we got an act that was written about the things the lawyers cared about and the MBAs cared about, but completely, through a first order approximation, bypassed what all the smart engineers in the information technology companies were actually thinking about. That's less likely to happen today, but it's less likely to happen in a way that is dysfunctional for the purpose of getting say what we would call an idealistic reform, because now it's sort of all out in the open. There's some of it that's not quite out in the open, which is what's going to happen to the wireless industry. One of the more interesting conversations to have over dinner in the Silicon Valley these days is how completely screwed up the wireless industry is and how it's going to be completely disrupted within the next 5 years. That isn't reflected in the debates in Washington. The people out there, the counterparts to, say, Google when it was founded in 1998 or whatever it was, those people now in the wireless segment, are every bit as invisible as Google was. The kids at Google weren't even started yet in the 1996 Act, but they came along within a couple of years, but there were people like them out there, and they didn't participate in the process. Now they will. There's a whole set of companies and user groups have a mobilization capability that they didn't have in '96. So more people have to get a slice of the baby to find a compromise that's going to be acceptable, that's going to be able to command a sufficiently large number of votes in both houses of Congress and get the president's signature to get an act. And the problem with this is that when you start dealing more and more and more divide the baby cuts, more giving this person a little bit of an advantage over there and giving another person a little bit of an advantage over there as part of the compromise to get legislation, you end up with your 600 or 700 or 800 page long bill. You end up with Waxman-Markey's climate change bill. You end up with the Clean Air Act of 1970, which took 20 years to undo, with its new source performance standards and differential, all these things that created humongous inefficiency because they were all part of Divide the Baby. Well, that's what we face as all the organized interests get better organized. Again, partly through use of the internet, through use of the very phenomenon that was made possible by the fact we neglected wireless. Thank God we neglected wireless in the '96 Act. All that has made it more difficult. And it's one of those things where you sort of have to be afraid of what you get. What I'm most afraid of is that you get a nice, in principle, idealistic reform, the simplification, the let's focus on the core issues and principles. You get that at the start, and that's the first 50 pages. And then the politics starts, and you get 750 more pages to Divide the Baby that ties us up in even worse knots than the '96 Act has tied us up. So I don't know how to avoid that, and but on the other hand, I think I probably don't have to worry about it because as the congressman said, there are certain issues like net neutrality, which net neutrality incidentally is a subset of a bigger issue, which is the distributional effects, and in particular the conflict between various kinds of consumer groups who normally aren't represented but now are beginning to be because of the internet. So net neutrality is a perfect illustration of something that has become partisanized, but I think there's a broader class of things that have become partisanized. And as soon as that happens in the contemporary Congress, the idea of getting a bill that actually would do something gets quickly replaced by having symbolic battles over ideologies. I'll just leave you with the important thought, and I've actually done this, compared the distribution of scores on ideology of Congress in 1996 versus last year. In 1996, if you plot the most conservative Democrat and the most liberal Republican, 58% of Congress is in between them. You know what the percentage is today? 0. No bill.
I want the other panelists to have a chance to respond, but let me just ask a question. There seem to be 3 possible outcomes from all the things that you were saying, that you sort of said 3 different sort of things. One is that an act would just be, at best, a symbolic gesture. But also we could end up tying everything in knots, which maybe is a deadweight loss, but neutral approach. And the third is
it keeps out the new guy.
Right, exactly. Well, that's what I was going to say is the third. The third is something that explicitly protects the status quo from disruptions that some people can see coming.
Doesn't this? I would argue that the status quo explicitly protects the status quo.
Okay.
So, kind of in an argument against interests, I would say that the current environment, with its extremely complex environment and extremely difficult to navigate how to get policy changes done, is actually better for the larger entities who have entrenched interests. I think if you go to a formula that Phil outlined, that has an open environment in which you set these general principles and you kind of allow innovation to happen, and the expert agency then looks at applying whatever principles they have to see if there's transgressions that are stopping innovation, and they intervene on a case-by-case basis, you're much more likely to be enabling innovation in that environment than I think you are today.
So I'm still trying to get over how depressing Roger's comments were. So
I told you I'm acidic.
It's okay, it's okay. So two points worth making. One is Roger pointed why Scott Tipton's joke last night is problematic for this process, which he said Congress is out of session so we can all rest easy. So if the premise is that Congress actually doesn't, won't, or can't solve problems that make things better off, we're already defeated, right? Because you need the premise that Congress can do things that improve the overall innovation ecosystem. In a recent survey of venture capitalists about confidence in government, governments across the world, the U.S. government came remarkably low. And so that is a fundamental point about what government can do here. I think we're all saying that government in theory could make things better, but to do that would require being in a different place than we are today. Now, Roger, you'd get to structural factors that are different than sort of the, let's call it attitudinal or leadership ones. On those, I wonder, on the 86 Tax Reform Act, public choice theory would have said that never should have happened, right? Because you ended up having interest groups get shut out. So what's your take on the 86 Tax Reform Act, and does that provide any windows of hope for where we are today?
First of all, the argument I gave isn't a public choice argument, so please don't tag me with that.
Good question.
Secondly, I think that I agree with you that I think that there is something out there called entrepreneurship, and it happens in both the public sector and the private sector. Just like there are people like Steve Jobs in the information technology sector, there are people like Bill Bradley in the political sector who was an entrepreneur who saw a way to create a temporary political majority for something that has never been popular before or since. The one advantage he had then about the substance was that there is this thing out there called lower taxes that is made feasible by this. In other words, the tax reform was not used purely for the purpose of generating more revenue by eliminating loopholes. A lot of people could be bought off in the tax domain by simply having their taxes lower. That substantively is harder to do in a regulatory environment because you don't have the direct quid pro quo you can get to buy people. And then the second thing I think is the difference in the politics, that Bill Bradley operated in a world in which there wasn't something like the internet and its decentralization and that has occurred. He operated in a world in which there was where the majority of people in Congress were in the middle. They weren't ideologues on either extreme. And so, I think those circumstances have to be taken into account. I don't think we're going to get a tax reform bill now. And we need one now as badly as we needed one in '86 because we've had the intervening almost 30 years of erosion on an annual basis of what was accomplished in '86. I think if Bill Bradley tried to do the same thing today, he would fail.
I think we have about 10 minutes left for if there are questions. Sure, right here and then there, and then there. Wait for the mic. Which is
enormous breadth of stuff here. I'm going to zero in on one particular aspect. Phil Weiser, you talked about standards, and so my ears perked up. In the telco environment, standards are done in a government-oriented and top-down, sort of imposed. In the internet, the standards are done outside of government, outside of membership kind of operation, and the standards are agreed upon but not imposed, and then market forces typically lead to that. How is that going to play into the evolution that you're talking about here?
So the short answer is those two traditions are going to confront Congress and the FCC, and already are, because there are a range of issues. So I'll take one. Access for people who are hearing impaired. In the VoIP world, You know, you need to have devices that they can use. In the old world, it was a TTY, was that the service? So how do you make those transitions? And if you allow people, and you have a range of decentralized operators to adopt the standards or not, then people subscribe to a service assuming they're going to have access if they're hearing impaired, and they might not. And so there's a real risk here on both sides, which is if you don't create some structure to move standardization along with some accountability or oversight, then you risk not achieving the goal, whether it's 911 or hearing impaired. If you do, you risk that becoming a tool by which those who play the regulatory process very well can use it against the more decentralized, innovative process of the internet. How to think through and solve that standardization problem is something that we need a lot of more thought and care, because the institutions of the FCC follow the more hierarchical model, not the more network internet-based one. And so that's one of the issues that has to get confronted and solved. And I think part of the challenge is you need the right problem-solving mentality to say, okay, this is not an issue that's a partisan issue, right? Hearing impaired 911 access, we want that, and yet we want VoIP to proliferate in all sorts of services too. And we don't want it to be used in a way that crushes innovators who might not necessarily be able to do it as quickly as someone else. And so those are the sorts of issues that have to get solved. I don't think there's a ready, easy answer that I can give you right now.
Yeah, right there, and then after Harold.
You've been talking about a congressional process where the reform is designed from the bottom up by congressional people. Could you comment on the pros and cons of an administration walking in with a proposal and trying to sell it through Congress?
I don't think that's likely to happen. This administration has not been as actively involved in telecom policy as, for example, the Clinton administration was when Al Gore was personally interested, had played a role in telecom policy debates when he was in Congress, and was basically assigned that brief by the president during their 8 years in office. So it was a time when there was certainly a lot of discussion from the administration, some actual proposals, but we don't have that today. I think the new telecom reform is going to be committee-driven, as influenced by comments from a broad range of interested stakeholders in the private sector, in academia, in the public interest and consumer community. And I might add that we have a more lively consumer and public interest community today than we had in 1996. And so there's been a discussion about stakeholders from the edge who are new participants, and they certainly are, and their voice is being heard in Washington because of their enhanced presence there and their importance to the entire internet ecosystem. And they're going to be key participants, but don't overlook the fact that the public interest groups, I saw Ed Black's hand here just a moment ago, and others in the consumer space are going to be major participants in this next debate to an extent that they were not in 1996. I want to just briefly call or respond to something we heard earlier on the panel. I was intrigued by the distinction between legislating as a goal versus messaging as a goal. And I would only comment that in the telecom space, once you leave network neutrality aside, and if there's to be success in telecom reform, it has to be left aside. It's far too explosive to be accommodated within the reform and keep it in the center and keep it bipartisan. Can't pass unless it is. But once you put network neutrality aside, there's really not a lot of messaging opportunity left in the other elements of telecom reform. So if this process is undertaken, I don't think messaging becomes a key part of the motivation. Now, there was a mention of fundraising in the earlier question. And the reality is that everything that happens in Washington happens against a background of certain well-understood realities. And fundraising is certainly part of that. And the committees that are considering high-profile legislation that the private sector cares about are going to be pretty successful in fundraising. I'm going to have to plead guilty to that myself. But it's a reality. It's a day-to-day reality. And I don't think that drives a telecom reform. You know, there are plenty of other fundraising opportunities for members of the Energy and Commerce Committee. They do pretty well. It's it's the committee in the House that the business community tends to care the most about, now that Ways and Means doesn't seem to be doing much at all. And so I don't think members are going to come to this issue out of a fundraising interest either. The other comment I'd like to make is, you know, we didn't see the internet coming in the '96 Act. Maybe it's a good thing we didn't. What we did was create a category of information services as distinct from telecommunications services, and that provided a very convenient framework for the FCC in later years to forbear, to declare that internet-based services are information services and not to impose the heavy hand of regulation. And the result has been a massive amount of investment, a large amount of innovation, and the internet becoming the platform that has disrupted the economy and grown it enormously. I don't think that would have happened had we had Title II regulation throughout the last decade. So, you know, creating that distinction, information services versus telecom services, was a very useful addition to the '96 Act. And maybe we didn't exactly see the internet coming in the way it is today, but we could see that information services were different, a thing apart, and needed to be categorized and regulated separately.
Can I just respond to the administration question for a second too? And that is, you know, just as in the '96 Act, as Rick said, this is going to have to be a bipartisan effort. I don't see the administration bringing a comprehensive proposal to Congress to start with. But I think the timetable that Chairman Upton and Walden have set puts us on a path to, and I think because this is a presidential election year, I think by the time we're sitting here next year, the House could be done, could have already voted on this legislation, or could be voting on it in September. If that timetable holds true, the administration is going to come forward, and I am optimistic anyways, it's the last 2 years of the president's term. We'll work with Congress to try to get something that's a signable package. This would be in the technology area that the administration has set out as one of their top priorities. This would be an incredible legacy for the president to be able to sign something like this with all of the issues that have been discussed on this panel, from spectrum to internet governance to other issues. I'm optimistic that they would come forward early on and start engaging in the process, and I think that Senate would be not too far behind the House as well.
Harold.
So, Harold Fell with Public Knowledge. First, I do want to thank Representative Boucher for pointing out the enhanced role of the public interest community in these debates. We saw this in SOPA-PIPA, obviously. We saw a little bit of this in cell phone unlocking. We're certainly seeing it in network neutrality, which, even if it's not part of broader reform, I suspect will at some point be resolved through congressional action, whatever the FCC ultimately decides, because it is such a critically important issue. But I did want to put to the panel a question of this sort of notion that what Congress does or doesn't see coming, and its distinction with with what Phil Weiser was raising about doing things in broad principles, because there's certainly plenty of broad principles in the 1996 Act which spoke to the evolution of broadband, notably the Section 706, which was, we know something is going to happen, we want to make sure that it gets deployed to everyone. We had a value about making sure that it's deployed in a timely fashion to everyone. And in terms of just sort of I guess some of these pieces that have come out, I might suggest, what do you all think about some of these things being, sort of broken up, done in pieces, which I think is somewhat more likely, We've seen a number of different bills out there. Wireless, for example, to go back in time, was done. We didn't do it in 96 because we'd done it in 93. Is there a better chance of getting these things through by taking a couple of these very high-level issues where we've seen some discrete focus like video reform and spectrum or some of these others and breaking those out rather than trying to have the broadly comprehensive telecom reform, which was the effort in 96?
Yeah, why do we always put it together into one?
Well, so we don't always put it together into one. And I think, Harold, you get to some really powerful points. So, for example, in 1978, there was the pole attachment law that Tim Wirth talks about as a very important moment for that committee thinking about pro-competition, because the idea of facilitating competition in telecommunications was a fairly new concept that began to emerge. And Tim would say the '84 Cable Act was another law that was trying to help the cable industry really be able to stand up fully against the broadcasters who had spent 20 years trying to regulate cable out of existence. So I think there's something to what you said, Harold, and I'd put another point on it, which is smaller bite-sized elements give Congress a chance to experiment with strategies. So getting back to the question about standardization, Congress did pass a Video Accessibility Act. I think it's called the 21st Century Video Accessibility Act, which struggles with some of these very questions about how do you enable closed captioning for internet video, dealing with how standards get set, concerns about how they would impact on innovation. And so the ability to pass smaller, bite-sized legislation, see how it works, plays a very healthy effect in offering guidance on what can work. If you try to wait to do a big bang, and you haven't actually tried out some of the approaches before, it's a high-risk bet. Whereas if you've done some more smaller experiments that give you guideposts on the road, you're more likely to succeed. So, Harold, that's a great point. I would certainly think there's a lot of merit there.
It is a good question. I would just point out that the 96 Act began as a piecemeal exercise. Separate bills were introduced to allow telephone companies to offer video in region, to allow an opening of the local exchange. There were certainly efforts, if not specific legislative proposals, that would let the R-Box into the long-distance market and supersede the modification of final judgment, Judge Green's order. And it wasn't until these ideas had percolated for some period of time that it became apparent that on their own they couldn't succeed. Collectively, potentially, they could succeed because there were trade-offs among the key stakeholders, people surrendering something to get something of greater value that enabled the whole to be greater than the sum of the parts. I don't think individually these measures ever would have passed. Collectively, they did. It's a little different this time. I don't know where the obvious trade-offs are. The public switch telephone network is now a relic. Only 5% of consumers use it exclusively. Another 28% use it in combination with wireless. 2/3 of communications users have left it altogether. It's expensive to maintain. We need a sunset. Congress probably needs to clear away some of the statutory underbrush and barriers that would stand in the way of a sunset perhaps by the end of this decade. I don't know what the trade-off for that is. I don't know who comes into the equation and adds support to the bill that otherwise would be lacking that enables that piece to pass. There, you know, on the wireless side, you have a fairly discrete set of issues, but highly important in terms of making sure the spectrum is there to meet the ever-growing demand for data services and encourage the development, both wired and wireless, of the next generation of super-fast networks in order to accommodate it.
So I think
and it's not clear where the trade-offs are for that. So I guess where I come out on your question is, we don't know. You know, the committee is starting from, let's do it all at once. Maybe that works. Maybe in the end, individual pieces begin to predominate and get broken out. It could wind up either way.
But this is the kind of thing that Congress
really
actually
very quickly,
does.
otherwise
Yeah.
the other panel is going to come sit on our laps.
Congress actually does this really well. This is, I mean, one thing they know how to do is what Rick said, is they do the math on the votes, and they can figure out is if you pull all these things, do you accumulate positive votes or negative votes? And so pulling a big train together versus separate cars is something that they actually have some experience doing. The reality also, Harold, is that one train starts to move, those who have interests in the other areas start saying and perhaps holding that train hostage, and we're seeing this in a couple of bills going through Congress right now, like the internet tax bill, where other legislation is being made to be put on that train, or people aren't going to let it go. That's also the reality of Congress. So it's going to be a little bit of balancing of each of those.
Good, shiny. So this was, thanks for coming to the panel. Thank you for the panelists. I thought this was very interesting. Please join me in thanking them. And don't go anywhere because the next panel is coming right up on big data.